Honourable Member for Nanaimo Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It is a privilege to rise again this evening to discuss the devastating flooding we saw this fall in British Columbia. I know there is a lot of work still to be done to repair infrastructure and rebuild from this extreme flooding situation. For many people across the country, last year's forest fires and flooding were a wake-up call that we're living with the consequences of the climate crisis. This is a human-caused emergency, and we are paying the price for years of climate inaction. In my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith, First Nation communities felt the impacts of flooding most acutely. When I spoke to Chief Roxanne Harris last fall, she had expressed her frustration and the difficulty she had connecting with timely federal supports to ensure that Staminas First Nation was able to get the support they needed. The lack of timely supports meant the flood damage turned to mold damage, putting people's health at risk. This mold could have been avoided if the immediate supports required were made available. While it is critical that we take lessons from last year's flooding, for too many First Nation communities, this was not an isolated event. It has put a spotlight on the failures of the federal government to support First Nations infrastructure for decades. As the climate crisis is worsening, we know that infrastructure already pushed to its limits will not be able to keep up with this crisis. Chief Wise of Snuneymuxw First Nation highlighted that flooding is a yearly reality in his community. Each year, community members are forced to vacate their homes due to flooding. They are still in the process of trying to secure funding for upgrades to the infrastructure along the riverbank, but this isn't a new issue. It's a crisis that community feels every year. Both Staminas and Snuneymuxw have both highlighted that their sacred burial sites are being eroded each year. This is shameful. No community in Canada should be forced to flee their homes each year or worry about the integrity of the land in which their loved ones are laid to rest. But that is the reality for too many Indigenous communities. While this Liberal government talks a lot about support for Indigenous communities, we're not seeing the urgent investment in Indigenous infrastructure across the country that we need. Whether it is on Vancouver Island with flood mitigation infrastructure, Kashechewan First Nation in Northern Ontario, where hundreds of people need to evacuate each year, or Iqaluit, which has continued to struggle to ensure the community has access to clean drinking water. We must radically rethink how we ensure communities get the support they need as the climate emergency becomes more severe. As a Member of Parliament, one of the most frustrating things I find is that when First Nations are looking for support, the federal government seems to only be able to provide dead ends. So many of the programs that the government likes to point to have been closed for years because demand for support was so high and the funding provided by the government did not meet communities' needs. Indigenous communities across Canada have been at the forefront of the climate emergency and have been sounding alarm bells about how the federal government is failing to address the climate emergency. We have seen time and again that Indigenous knowledge and their connection to land have been ignored or minimized when they raise serious concerns about our rapidly changing climate. This is especially troubling as the history of colonization has been one of forced relocation of Indigenous communities to some of the land most at risk to climate change. Madam Speaker, failing to learn from Canada's history only serves to extend Canada's shameful colonial history. My question to the government is this: how much worse does the climate crisis need to become before we create a meaningful climate action plan, one that is created in true partnership with Indigenous communities such as Staminas, Snuneymuxw, Liaxin, and Snuneymuxw,
Parlementaire de la Ministre de l'Agriculture et de l'Agriculture.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I would like to thank my honourable colleague from Nanaimo Ladysmith for the question. I also want to acknowledge that we are here on the unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The impacts of climate change are being felt right across Canada, but without question, we know Indigenous and Northern communities are among the most affected. The government shares her concerns about the unprecedented flooding of November that forced countless people out of their homes, eroded land, and destroyed roads in British Columbia. We can only imagine how challenging the extreme weather events of this past year have been for the families and communities impacted. We've been keeping in close contact with First Nations leadership and affected communities to ensure that they have the supports they need. As they have done in facing repeated crises of late, First Nation leaders have shown immense strength and resilience under pressure in dealing with a complex and evolving situation. Indigenous Services Canada has committed to continue supporting Indigenous leadership to ensure that First Nations have the information and resources they need to keep their community members safe and supported. Since the fire events of last summer, Indigenous Services Canada has provided $6.2 million in addition in funding for the First Nations Emergency Services Society through the Emergency Management Assistance Program. These funds supported the First Nations Emergency Services Society to assist First Nations in their response and recovery from last year's devastating events, including conducting rapid damage assessments in communities impacted by flooding. Indigenous Services Canada also provided $578,000 to the First Nation Leadership Council to support its member organizations. In BC, the government has a service agreement with Emergency Management BC to provide emergency management services on reserve, comparable to those available to other BC communities. As part of the Emergency Management Assistance Program, the Department reimburses First Nations, as well as provinces, territories, and authorized third-party emergency service providers 100% of eligible response and recovery costs. We will work diligently with Emergency Management BC to ensure the funds are released quickly to communities. A tripartite memorandum of understanding on emergency management services with the First Nations Leadership Council, the Province of British Columbia, and Indigenous Services Canada also sets the stage for a trilateral approach. We're working with the Province of British Columbia and the First Nation Leadership Council to move the current bilateral agreement into a trilateral agreement as outlined in the MOU and based on views of First Nation leadership. We have committed to advancing the meaningful recognition and enhanced capacity of First Nations within all pillars of emergency management. Indigenous Services Canada has supported the First Nation Emergency Services Society in the coordination of a multi-agency support team that includes the First Nations Health Authority, the First Nation Leadership Council, and Emergency Management BC regional staff. Indigenous Services Canada is continuing to meet regularly with First Nation leadership and communities that are affected by the recent floods to discuss this issue in light of their own unique circumstances and need. The Government of Canada is committed to working with communities, however long the recovery takes, to help ensure First Nations members are safe and secure. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the member opposite. I really appreciate your response, but the actions of the government over the last 6 years speak loudly. It's clear that we're not getting the results that we need. The climate crisis is growing worse as this government continues to miss its targets. On this side of the House, NDP members have put forward bold legislation to ensure that Canada is supporting Indigenous communities with meaningful investments while standing up to the climate crisis. My colleague's bill, for example, C245, would make sure that Canada Infrastructure Bank prioritizes Indigenous and Northern communities in the fight against climate change. Similarly, my colleague's motion M1 calls on the government to develop a Green New Deal for Canada. The motion demands that the government invest in a net zero future with reconciliation at the forefront. Does the member opposite agree that we need to rethink our approach to the climate crisis and ensure Indigenous communities get the investments they deserve?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, absolutely. And that's why, from day one, on November 26, 2021, the Prime Minister and the Premier of British Columbia announced a committee of federal and provincial ministers to work with Indigenous leadership to guide support to British Columbia families, businesses, and communities affected by the recent extreme weather events linked to climate change. We're working with partners to improve economic and social conditions for Indigenous people so that they can invest in infrastructure in other areas to ensure the well-being as they respond to climate change. Thank you, Madam Speaker.